Hi, folks, and welcome to the broadcast. Today's podcast, we're going to be talking about blood pressure and more specifically how to lower it quickly, which sounds kind of like a controversial thing to say, well, you can lower your blood pressure quickly, given the fact that, for the most part, we're just put on medication and told this is what you need to control your blood pressure. I'm going to show you in a couple of steps how to lower your blood pressure now. In order to do this and in order to do it legitimately in a way that's believable, I want to show you the mechanism. So I'm going to go a little bit into the science of how to lower your blood pressure, only because it's important that I'm not perceived to say, change your diet and eat healthier and your blood pressure will lower, because that's not true. And it's not the full story either. So as a little bit of a sort of an introduction on the previously held beliefs around blood pressure, we used to think that the main drivers of blood pressure were things like weight, which is only partially true. It's not actually that your weight gain drives high blood pressure. It's that there's a shared mechanism behind both of them. High blood sugar levels leading to high levels of insulin causes weight around the midsection, and the same insulin drive causes high blood pressure. It's not that being overweight in and of itself is solely responsible for blood pressure or even a main contributor to blood pressure per se. It's that they share a pathophysiological mechanism. That's the same thing as driving high blood pressure as driving weight gain. So you tend to see them together. There's also a sub-cohort of people who are a normal weight and have sky high blood pressure. So that's why, it's not only that the weight gain causes high blood pressure. The second thing we used to think drives high blood pressure, and the research on this is really interesting, is salt. So we used to think that salt in your arteries causes high blood pressure, and it does. Therefore, we use that to extrapolate out incorrectly, I would argue, that salt in your diet causes high blood pressure. And actually, what the research has shown from a publication in the New England Journal of Medicine, a meta-analysis on hundreds of thousands of people, I'll show you this in a second, shows that too little salt can be harmful for your heart. Too much salt can also definitely be harmful for your heart and drive blood pressure up. But somewhere in the middle is a kind of a sweet spot. So we'll talk about that in a second. Now, if you're on blood pressure medication, and this is important, I'm not saying stop taking your blood pressure medication, but if you follow the dietary advice I'm about to give you, chances are that you'll need less, possibly no blood pressure medication. So let's jump into the science on this one a little bit. Okay, so first of all, and by the way, thanks for joining. Andy is my name. I'm the clinical lead at ReadyCare, so I love all this kind of sciencey stuff. I put together all the research that goes into our program. So blood pressure is a really interesting one. Now, what's emerged in the clinical literature over the last kind of 7 or 8 years in particular has been that, yes, smoking is definitely a contributing factor to high blood pressure. Yes, stress is definitely a contributing factor. But the main one by an absolute mile is a hormone called insulin. Now, you'll hear me talking about insulin all the time. Insulin is a hormone that's produced by your body when your blood sugar levels are high. So actually, not only is salt not necessarily harmful, up to a point anyway, unless you're taking in huge amounts of it for your blood pressure, but sugar is definitely the main driver of high blood pressure. And this becomes very obvious if you work as a clinician, because you will see 90% of the time people with either a lot of weight around the midsection or type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes will almost always have high blood pressure. So when I'm in doing health assessments at a corporate level, what I'll notice all the time is if someone is storing a lot of weight around the midsection, if they're pre-diabetic, or if they say to me during the consult, God, I have a mad sweet tooth, or I eat a lot of sugary stuff, or I just eat a very high carb diet, you're almost always going to see high blood pressure. It's almost a given. So let's take a look at why that might be and the connection between both of those things. Okay, so insulin resistance. There's a couple of terms that I want to break down here just before we go into the science of it. And this is not, I don't want to be as reductionist as to say, well, eating bad food gives you high blood pressure. I want to explain why at a higher level science, and then come down to kind of a simpler takeaway practical messages in terms of food choices. So insulin resistance, just to explain the term, your pancreas is obviously an organ in your body, and it's one of its main responsibilities, not its only one, is to produce a hormone called insulin, and sometimes people get this twisted and they'll say, oh, insulin is bad, it does all these bad things. It's not actually. Insulin is critical for hundreds of physiological processes around the body. But overproduction of insulin, having too much insulin, is actually very, very bad for your weight, for your blood pressure, for fatty liver, for a number of different functions. So if we take a look at the various different processes around the body, You have the central nervous system, which it increases central nervous system, what they call sympathetic nervous system activity when your insulin levels are high. In your blood vessels, it both constricts and blocks their ability to relax. And the fancy way of saying that is there's diminished release of something called nitric oxide from the endothelium. Endothelium is just the inside of your artery wall. So basically, diminished release of nitric oxide means it stops your body releasing the chemical pathway that allows your blood vessels to relax. So when your blood sugar levels are high, your blood vessels are tighter. The other thing it does is it increases a secretion of something called endothelin-1, which is a potent vasoconstrictor. So when insulin is high, think of boa constrictor. You've got constriction of your blood vessels at the same time as a blocked ability for your blood vessels to relax. So it's a double whammy of something that will increase your blood pressure. Now, the last kind of pathway I want to talk about very quickly, just to delve into the science very briefly, is insulin levels being high causes increased sodium retention in the arteries. Now, just a couple of minutes ago, I spoke about the connection between salt in your arteries and high blood pressure. Where you have salt in your arteries, not in your diet, in your arteries, when it gets into your arteries, fluid will follow that salt and you'll have a larger volume of fluid to go through the same narrow space. And the heart then, as a response to that, has to increase the pressure it beats at to get that volume of fluid through. So basically, if you have salt in your arteries, you have more fluid follows salt, and you have high blood pressure as a result to cope with that. Now, interestingly, what happens when your blood sugar levels go high, your pancreas secretes more and more insulin, and insulin triggers the kidneys to increase sodium retention in the arteries. So you have a dysfunction that happens where you have more sodium in your arteries. If you've ever wondered why you get up in the morning after a pizza and a little bit of ice cream and you're up 3 pounds, you're going, how in the name of Christ am I up 3 pounds? If I weigh the food on the food scales downstairs, it weighs 800 grams. And now I've quadrupled that weight put on. It's because when your blood sugar levels go high from carbs and sugar, your insulin levels go high. Insulin instructs the kidneys to retain salt, which causes a lot of water retention. So that's for the same reason why if you don't eat for a day or something like that because you're sick, blood sugar levels go low, insulin goes low, and you drop a ton of weight all of a sudden. You can go down 4, 5, 6 pounds and then put it all back on. That's water. That's what's going on there. So when your blood sugar levels are high from processed food, things like, breads, cereals, even rice, pasta, frozen pizzas, granola bars, sugary stuff, basically all the stuff we love, all that stuff that tastes amazing. Blood sugar levels go up, insulin goes up, there's increased sodium retention in the kidneys, and blood pressure goes up. So it's not unusual for people to see their blood pressure drop dramatically in 3 or 4 days. Blood pressure just to drop way down just by cutting carbs and sugar down or out of their diet. So this is just a graph just from a study done way back in 2013, about 10 years ago, that showed that if all you do is infuse insulin in patients, these are patients who don't normally have high blood pressure. If you just increase their insulin level a little bit, you'll see their what's known as your diastolic blood pressure, which is the bottom reading. So you've got systolic on top and diastolic on the bottom. If you increase insulin, if you just inject them with insulin for a couple of days, you'll see 9, 10, 12, 14 days, you'll see their blood pressure going up about 10 millimoles. It'll go way up. And then when you don't put the people on insulin, you have a control group, their blood pressure stays the same. So you can increase someone's blood pressure just by injecting them with insulin. So high blood pressure is an insulin-dependent state. If we dial down insulin in the blood by eating less sugar and carbohydrate, blood pressure goes down, and it goes down pretty dramatically. Now, I'll come back to how we do this in diet in a couple of slides time. But before I do, this is just a myth that I like to kind of dispel. So the idea that salt in your arteries gives you high blood pressure is absolutely correct, but we can't extrapolate that and conflate that as being salt in your diet increases your blood pressure, because there's been numerous studies that show people and even countries with the highest sodium intake, some Asian studies because of soy sauce and various different fermented foods, their salt intake is through the roof at 7 or 8 grams. Yet they have some of the lowest blood pressure around the world. Now, I know there's loads of other factors, like that some of those parts don't eat Western foods, don't have a lot of sugar in their diet. But it's interesting that salt alone, you can't point to salt in any epidemiological study and say, this country eats more salt, therefore. There's too many other factors at play anyway to make that kind of correlation and propose a causative mechanism there. So I say all of that to say that what the literature shows is if your salt intake is below about 3 grams a day, And that's pretty difficult to do. You'd want to be, low sodium this and low sodium that to do that. There's actually an increased risk. If you look at the x-axis there on the left, highest and lowest health risk, the highest risk from a sodium point of view is if you take in no sodium or very little sodium in your diet. You see this all the time, ultra endurance athletes dying of massive heart attacks because they didn't have enough sodium, especially in the heat. That's one of the leading causes of heart failure when you exercise yourself to death in those extreme instances, is that all the sweat coming out, it's the sodium that comes out and there's dysregulation of heart function. So at the very lowest level, it's dangerous. At the very highest level, it's also dangerous. Now, the Chinese average is kind of 6-7 grams, and their blood pressure is some of the lowest in the world. But if you go way above that, to be honest with you, I've tried it just to see, it's virtually impossible. You're talking 8 or 9 teaspoons of salt on stuff. If you're eating a lot of processed food, maybe you could do it, maybe, but very unlikely. Somewhere in the middle there is kind of the sweet spot. So I heavily salt my food, and I get about 3.5 grams of salt a day, 4 grams, which is in and around the sweet spot. So that's just to kind of explain out the whole connection between salt and high blood pressure. We used to think that too much salt is bad for you, and salt ends up in your arteries and causes high blood pressure. Therefore, any sodium in the diet is bad, and we just blanket all of salt. And this is despite the fact that we have lots of paleoanthropology and even kind of ancestral studies that would say that remote tribes around the world, a lot of them would have heavily salted their food as a kind of a mechanism to preserve food, and added lots of salt to their food, and they still do, and they never have blood pressure issues. So the main factor there between people who salt their food loads and people who just salt their foods a fair bit, and why they do and don't get blood pressure in these different tribes, is actually the introduction of processed food. Where you have processed food, you get high blood pressure. Salt itself, in and of itself, is not to blame. It's kidney dysfunction from your blood sugar levels being high that ends up trapping that salt in your arteries. So just to show you a quick, let me see if I have that study here. Oh, no, I don't have it. That's okay. Okay, so I'll just make a quick reference to it. But we published a study back in 2017 where I said to people who had high blood pressure, I said, you don't need to reduce your salt intake. Just use like a pink Himalayan rock salt or something like that. And go on a lower carb diet, so eating less bread, rice, pasta, cereal, bananas, potatoes, and the really sugary stuff. And eat more kind of meat, eggs, cheese, butter, cream, just real food, fruits, vegetables, all that sort of stuff. The average blood pressure reduction outperformed one blood pressure medication, meaning that the reduction in blood pressure, despite the fact that they weren't lowering their salt intake, many of them added more salt because they were saying, oh, I was watching my salt intake, so I'm going to add a little bit of salt now. The average blood pressure reduction was, I think it was 7 or 8 millimoles of mercury, which means your blood pressure going from like 130 down to 123, and the bottom one going from 90 down to 83 and so on. So about 7 or 8 mils. Actually, I think a more recent study is more like 10 or 11, but that outperforms a blood pressure medication, like really, really powerful stuff, by lowering your blood sugar levels, not by reducing salt in your diet. These are the mechanisms. This is just the 4 different sites on the kidneys instructing Na, which is Na+, which is sodium, to be retained in the arteries, causing high blood pressure. And these are the pathways, I should say, for uric acid and nitric oxide release. So again, no need to go into those anymore. Your blood sugar levels being high, we're absolutely certain of this now. It's beyond well established in the literature. Blood sugar levels being high causes production of a hormone called insulin. That's very well established. When that goes on for too long, you end up diabetic. If we can reverse engineer that and eat lower carb foods, your blood sugar levels come down. We've demonstrated this in numerous studies. Many of them we have reversal rates of upwards of kind of 48% of type 2 diabetes and significant reductions in blood pressure. And that's the main mechanism you need to know about. Now, this is important. If you have high blood pressure, I don't want you just to come off your medication straight away and go, a low carb diet will fix this. I mean, it would, and arguably that would be a better way to do it. Just to keep yourself safe for the moment, if you are on medication, remain on the medication and monitor your blood pressure. And if it gets to a point where it's getting a little bit too low or lower than it usually would be, at that point, that should be your cue to trigger a phone call into your GP and say to him or her, look, my blood pressure is usually 140 over 95. It's gone down to 115 over 65, and I'm taking the same amount of medication. Should I take less? So I can't give you any advice on medication one way or another, but that's how we usually deal with it with patients. So talking about the kind of practical takeaways. So guys, if you're looking to lower your blood pressure, and I'll show you a case study, and I probably have a couple on file here, of patients who have gone from blood pressures of, I mean, through the roof, 180, 190 over 130, 140, down to normal blood pressure in 8 to 12 weeks. Dial down carbohydrate and sugar-based foods in your diet. So bread, rice, pasta, and the breads, the rice, the pasta, you'll hear people saying, well, whole grain is better than white, therefore. The days of talking like that, or at least people who are very well informed talking like that, are long gone. We know now that whole grain is just marginally better than white. Brown pasta is marginally better than the usual variety of pastas. Breakfast cereals, try to avoid, with the exception of like a homemade granola recipe, which is low carb. Fizzy drinks, diet drinks, I mean, they come with their own host of problems, but they're certainly better than the full sugar ones. Obviously, cakes, pastries, scones, things like that. And interestingly, things that you wouldn't usually associate with being bad for you, things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, bananas, grapes, and tropical fruits. These are all very high sugar. And when you have an issue with blood pressure, you have an issue with sugar and insulin. So you want to dial down your intake of those and eat much more things like cauliflower, broccoli. 2 really good rules for you when it comes to fruits. Aim for fruits in the berry category, like strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, and avoid the kind of more tropical ones. And when it comes to vegetables, avoid the ones that grow below the ground. So very good rule of thumb there is vegetables that grow below the ground, avoid as much as possible. And anything that grows above ground, eat as much as you want. And I'll finish up on this slide and then a real interesting case study here as well. So if anyone has any questions, guys, pop them into the comments section here on YouTube. So if you just pop in the comment section any questions that you have, I'd love to answer any of your questions. The foods that you want to eat. Now, the title on this slide is Whole Foods for weight loss. The same thing applies for lowering your blood sugar levels and lowering your blood pressure because of the connection between blood sugars and insulin. So meats of any description. The idea that, I've done numerous talks on this, but the idea that meat may increase your risk of heart issues and cancer and stuff is just not based in any objective empirical evidence whatsoever. It was a correlation they looked at in the 70s that people, for some reason I can't understand, keep on repeating, despite the fact that there's been numerous meta-analysis done now saying there is no connection between red meat and cancer. The only one is that it probably lowers your risk of cancer when you look at all the literature. Personally, I eat red meat every single day, every day, sometimes twice a day. Fish and seafood, as much as you want. Again, the oilier, the better, but any fish is good for you. So things like mackerel, sardines, trout, salmon, all good. Omega-3s are good as well. Cheese, always full fat, never low fat. This idea that we should eat less fat so that we'd have less fat in our bodies. I mean, I'm not being funny, but if we look around, it hasn't worked as a kind of an experiment over the last 30 or 40 years. In fact, it's backfired horrendously. Vegetables, if it grows above the ground, eat as much as you want. If it goes below the ground, just moderate your intake of it from a weight loss and blood pressure point of view. Eggs, again, the idea that an ancient ancestral food might be trying to kill us, but only since the late 70s and only in the Western world, is just not true. Eat as many eggs as you want. Avocados, olive oil, nuts, seeds, real butter, and full fat dairy. All of those eat to the point that you want. Okay, so let's just take a quick look at this for 1 second. So the patient who came to me here now, this is just a really interesting kind of a case study. His blood pressure dropped pretty significantly, actually. So his systolic went down 13% and his diastolic 31%. So he went from a blood pressure of 132 over 114, and the bottom one been pretty high, to, what was he? No, excuse me, sorry, 132 over 114 over 80. Yeah, that's incorrect, sorry. But there was a drop of 31% anyway. The graph is representing it wrong. And again, the weight loss there was significant enough. He lost maybe 9 kg, something like that. But his HbA1c went from, which is your marker for diabetes, went from diabetic to kind of pre-diabetic. But you don't have to lose a lot of weight for your blood pressure to come down. It will come down anyway. Okay, couple of comments. Mary, hi, how are you? So how to deal with low blood pressure? How you would deal with low blood pressure, I suppose it depends on the cause of it, Mary. And if it's asymptomatic, and by that I mean you're not fainting or passing out or feeling really weak or feeling like you're going to get sick, then low blood pressure in and of itself is not really a problem, but it can be a sign of anemia, autoimmune conditions. There's various different conditions that can trigger low blood pressure in the background. Sometimes an iron supplement can help, but speak to your GP. But for the most part, if you're eating red meat and your iron levels are low and that's causing your blood pressure to go low, that's usually not because you're not eating enough red meat. It's not that you're not getting enough heme iron or animal-based iron. It's usually to do with dysfunction in the gut, so something called leaky gut syndrome. And the solution to that is you take probiotics, prebiotics, eat a whole food diet, eliminate sugar, alcohol, anything that would usually damage the gut lining. Can a thyroid issue cause it? Yes. Yes. And it's not so much, Mary, that the thyroid issue itself would cause the low blood pressure, but that there's a shared mechanism there. So a thyroid issue is an autoimmune condition. So for me, I had psoriasis, I had psoriatic arthritis. I used to get bouts of anxiety and depression that I couldn't explain in terms of my life circumstances. And that all came down to the gut issues I was having. So once I healed up the gut, all of those things went away. And for me, and this is only for me personally speaking, I went on a low carb diet. I eventually went onto a carnivore diet and I got rid of dairy. And for me, that's when it all healed. So now I follow more of a kind of a low carb diet. Margaret, can the menopause cause high blood pressure? Yes, Margaret, it can. It's not that the menopause itself would automatically cause high blood pressure, but during the menopause, you get exaggeration of what's happening with your hormones anyway. More specifically, that hormone we were just talking about, insulin, would go much higher. So there's some really interesting studies now looking at a low carb or ketogenic diet as a way to offset menopausal symptoms and optimize your hormones. So I've had numerous patients who are having like really bad night sweats and stuff like that completely stopped after 3 or 4 weeks on a low carb diet. And thanks for your question, guys. James, are we talking about a complete ketogenic diet? Not necessarily, James. So to my mind, the ketogenic diet is the ultimate way to lower your blood pressure. That with a little bit of fasting. I would go more towards low carb, and then if you're comfortable with that, go to a ketogenic diet. My only issue with a ketogenic diet, and for full disclosure here, I followed a ketogenic diet for 8 or 9 years, is that not everyone can fit it into their life and fully adapt to a ketogenic diet all the time. And my issue with keto is that it's not an issue, it's just a sort of something that's worth chatting about, is that people say, I'm on a keto diet, or you can't have apples on a keto diet. I had an apple, therefore I'm off a keto diet. And that's not how the human body works. You know, your blood sugar levels in your health exist on a broad spectrum that can go up and down all the time. And yeah, if you have an apple, would it knock you out of ketosis? Maybe. But why are we so worried about ketosis? So I wouldn't be too concerned. So I would go low carb, James. Leaning towards more keto, but low carb in and of itself is what will lower your blood pressure. And that study actually, James, I spoke about, where patients lowered their blood pressure more than medication would, was not a ketogenic diet. It was a low carb diet at about 120 grams of carbs a day. And one more from Hugh. Oh, how are you, Hugh? Haven't heard from you for a while. Oh yeah, you just said the same thing. Haven't been in touch for some time. I'm happy to report I've been taking off all diabetes medication this week, and many thanks for your help. Magic, Hugh. I'm delighted to hear about that. Actually, if you happen to know, you might just let us know if your blood pressure dropped as well. I can't remember off the top of my head if you had high blood pressure, but there you go. So just like Hugh's comment there, guys, it's incredible what you can do for type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, cholesterol, all of that sort of stuff. It really is. Hillary, thank you. Are your presentations recorded and can they be accessed? Looking forward to the next one. Yeah, absolutely, Hillary. So our presentations are recorded, and even if you just look on our YouTube channel, it will just be posted up there automatically. So you can click on the same link to watch it back, or any link that we've done before. And I know we're working towards putting all of our last 40 or 50 talks up on the Control DTX platform as well. So if you have access to that, you'll be able to get them. But you can go onto our YouTube page and just click through any of those that you want as well. Guys, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you joining me here today. And thank you too, James. And yeah, we'll see you soon. Don't forget to subscribe. Let me take this off while I'm talking to you. There we go. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you click the little bell notification, you'll get a notification when we go live. So you'll be able to see that. Super. Guys, thanks so much. And yeah, I really appreciate you being here. Take care. Talk to you soon. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.